So I want to welcome all of you to another talk from our series Vantage Points. In today's event, Alan Frame will present his new book, Whereupon, which was published by Palermo Publishing. And I also want to welcome Phil Taylor, who will be today's moderator. Thanks for joining. I'm Anja from StrudelmediaLive. We offer live online photography classes, and we are very lucky because Alan Frame teaches for us. We also organize photo talks like this one today. We also have a scholarship program, and we have a YouTube channel. If you miss any of our talks and you would like to watch them later, you can go to our YouTube channel and watch them there. We have also recently announced our spring photography classes, and I want to tell you about some of the upcoming courses and events. All of our online classes are live, and they are for small groups only. We usually only accept 8 students, and some classes only 6 students. We have a course coming up about the techniques and exercises in color photography with Shayla Miller. And an exciting course that is the performative self-portrait with Susana Pustajova, and she will be teaching from Slovakia. And then there will be Scott Rossi, who will teach photographing strangers. And the first round of his class sold out right away, so we added another section, and that will be an evening class, and that's photographing strangers. We also offer mini workshops, and mini workshops are 1-hour workshops. And the ones that are coming up are on AI photography. And also, if you want to improve your Lightroom skills, we also have some mini workshops coming up with that. I want to talk about our scholarships briefly. We will soon announce a new scholarship program for one-on-one mentoring. We will announce the open call very soon. And the last thing I want to announce is our next talk that is already in 1 week. It will be on Wednesday, April 3rd. And it will be 3 of our scholarship students who will present work that they created. One of them is from Greece, one from Ukraine, and one from Stockholm. They will be on Wednesday, April 3rd. So if you have questions during this talk, please put them in the chat. But at the end, you can also unmute and ask directly if you would like. I want to introduce Phil Taylor very briefly, who is our moderator today. Phil's research focuses on photography's place within 20th century avant-garde art, surrealism, and global modern and contemporary art. And in January 2022, he joined the George Eastman Museum as a New York City-based curator. So Phil, thank you so much for being the moderator. And Alan, thank you so much for being here as well. The talk will last about an hour, maybe an hour and 15 minutes. And I will now hand it over to Phil. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anja. It's a real honor to be here and be in dialogue with Alan and to be here with so many people who are interested in Alan's works, friends and colleagues. I met Alan, I believe, 5 years ago on the occasion of an exhibition at Baxter Street at the Camera Club of New York that he had curated of Ryan Forster's work. And in the ensuing years, as my familiarity with Alan's work, but also our dialogue and our friendship has evolved, I think I've found Alan to be a real paragon of generosity and someone who is exceptional in his ability to connect people. And I think this is something that's also evident in the photographs and many of the photographs that we'll be looking at today from his new book, Whereupon. Alan has been exhibiting photographs for 40 some years now, most recently with exhibitions at his representative Gitterman Gallery, also recently at Soft Network here in New York. He's a recipient of the Rome Prize and has published now, I believe, 4 books of photographs, if my accounting is correct there. But his areas of production and creativity are really wide-ranging, and I think that's something I'm also interested in hearing more about, the sort of connections and affiliations between all these things that you've been doing for several decades now, Alan. Um, he's adapted and directed plays for the theater. He's produced a feature film. He's even played Jack Nicholson in a production of Gary Indiana's play, The Roman Polanski Story. And on top of that, as many of you know, he is an exceptional educator who has really had an incredible impact on generations of photography students now for some time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alan and really look forward to continuing the conversation after he shares some of the work from his book with us.
Thank you so much, Phil, for that introduction. And it's such a great pleasure to have this conversation with you. Again, we live in adjacent neighborhoods and, get together from time to time to talk about mostly photo-related things. And it's wonderful to do this in a more formal way. And thank you so much, Anya and Edward, for inviting me to do this talk on Strudel Media. I also want to thank Tom Gitterman because I did a show of a lot of the work that's in this book, Whereupon, about a year and a half ago at his gallery. And I want to thank Michaela Palermo, who's here with us today, who launched her new press, Palermo Publishing, with this book. So I'm absolutely delighted to be part of this with her. She was the designer as well. She's a photographer I admire, and she has a lot of experience designing photo books. We did 3 photo zines together before we did this book, so we had an experience of, creating the trust over issues of sequencing and design and content before we began working on Whereupon. And I'm thrilled with the outcome. So, and later I will mention a book tour that we're doing in Italy in late May, give you some dates and venues for that. And also, I want to thank Soft Network, where I had a show last fall, because even though this book was not what was presented, we launched the book with that exhibition. So I'm going to share my screen now. This is the first picture in the book, and that was Michaela's decision. And I was really happy about that because Paul is a close friend today, goes back to when we met working at Capizio in the Village in the late 70s. We worked in another retail situation together, and we see each other a lot still. So he was my first New York boyfriend. This is my first New York apartment, a studio on East 30th. I just went by the other day. It was a furnished studio, which I probably not many of those left. Roll out sofa bed. And when I look at these pictures, one of the things I think about is, how small and crowded these New York apartments were that I was trying to photograph in. And yet, managed to do it. I think I found it even more daunting today using a medium format camera, but and looking at these, last night in preparation for this again, I was also just thinking about what a different time New York was. This is the late 70s. I moved here in 1977. I'd been living in Mississippi for 3 years, doing some very different work, gritty documentary work, mainly about one of my friends who was living hand to mouth with his grandmother. It also included pictures of my family. I had come back to Mississippi, was living with my family, working as a waiter, while photographing. And then I just got too restless and bored and had to move. And a lot of my friends from Boston, where I went to college, had moved to New York around the same time. So when I came here, there was a ready social world already. Jody Gorelnik, the artist on the right, I had met in Boston. She went to the Boston Museum School. Kevin Tier was an artist that she was seeing at this time. They're both alive and well and productive today. In fact, Jody just had a fabulous solo show at Nancy Hoffman Gallery in New York. She lives in Aspen. Kevin lives in Springs, Long Island, and had a show of his 70s work a couple of years ago that included some of my photographs, such as this one in his studio. So I came from this, grittier body of work in Mississippi to this, wanting to be around other artists and in this like really creative atmosphere in New York. And maybe I had this kind of romantic idea about being an artist. So there are a number of pictures of artists in their studio, like this one of Kevin. And in this picture of friends sunbathing on the roof of my 30th Street up studio, you see Jody Gorelnik again on the left, my close friend Butch Walker in the middle, who had also moved to Boston at this time, although she and I were both from Mississippi, but we met in Boston. She was a ballet dancer and then started acting in New York and taking acting classes. And the other woman is Dana Saglin, whose twin, Laurie, was a very close friend of mine, as in one of the upcoming pictures. Dana was creating these kind of dollhouse replicas of artists' bedrooms and studios, miniaturized. And Rob Pinner, lying in the foreground, was like Laurie Saglin assisting the fashion photographer Chris von Wagenheim at this time. And beyond this roof, somewhere back in there, lived Cornell Kappa, whose apartment opened onto a kind of terrace, and I could see him meeting out there with photo celebrities sometimes. In that same apartment, the poster on the wall is from Marilyn Monroe's film Let's Make Love. And this exemplifies how kind of the pictures can talk about actual moods and atmosphere, but sometimes what it's suggesting is not quite what is happening. So in this case, Susan, there are two writers, Susan Hager and Peter Jarrett, both visiting from Virginia, where they were doing MFAs in writing. Susan moved to New York, Peter to San Francisco. Susan was one of my closest friends in college, still very close, lives in LA. Peter, I was just meeting. The romantic thing that happened in this situation was not between them, but between me and him, as we all like slept in that room while they were visiting. This is Laurie Saglin, who started out as a fashion photographer, and we crossed paths again when I lived in London for 2 years in the mid-'80s. And just saw her for dinner recently. She's an old friend also of Jody Gorelnik. So it's great to revisit this time, but it's also great to have this continuity with so many of the people, although quite a few of the men died very young, either from AIDS or other reasons. This is Tommy Chesley, who was visiting Butch Walker and me when we were roommates in the West Village. Tommy was part of the circle of artists around Nan Golden and in Boston, and became a very close friend of Butch's and mine. and was also in that historic exhibition of art about AIDS in 1989 at Artist Space that Nan Goldin curated. But he died a couple of years later. He was a painter and stayed in Boston, came to New York for 1 year. Jody Gorelnik again on her rooftop on First Avenue near SVA with one of her boyfriends, Bruno Pine-Jakowski. This one probably shows the extent to which I feel influenced by Italian cinema of the late 50s, early 60s, especially the films of Antonioni. Something about this kind of charged psychological space and the space between figures who are inhabiting different planes of the image. And then another artist in a studio, David Wilson, who today still working, living in Maine on one of those islands off Maine. A Scottish artist who had moved to New York for his grad program. And roommate at one point of Jody Gorelnik. There's Butch, and one of the things that, I mean, Butch and I related so heavily, both having these Mississippi childhoods, but one of the things that was really striking to me about her always was that having trained in ballet, her just day-to-day movements were so lithe and beautiful, and she was always striking these positions that made me want to photograph her endlessly. That is a boyfriend of Tommy Chesley's who was down from Boston visiting Fabio, who I haven't seen since. I don't know what happened to him. Butch now lives upstate, and we see each other often. This is the two artists, Donald Newman and Dyke Blair. Donald moved into another field. Dyke is still very productive, having books and exhibitions. And I saw him for the first time in many years recently. It's great to catch up with him. Close friends, Charles Boone on the left, a painter who was also a fashion illustrator working for Women's Wear Daily, and Bill Jacobson, the writer, not the photographer. Both of them, Bill Jacobson died in the early 90s. Charlie died in 2001. And then John Hayes on the right, who I'll talk more about in a minute, who's still alive, living in Berlin. An amazing performer and muse for many photographers. But I was working a lot with low light levels and often photographing at about 1/30th, which creates this sort of motion blur. I also developed really fast street reflexes that are sort of like those of a street photographer, like trying to get compositions that had, interesting gesture and movement in them and configurations. And again, struggling with the limited space of small New York apartments. Those three people were really key in my social world and in that period. I was kind of in love with both Bill and Charlie, and then John was just one of the most interesting conversationalists I've ever known. And here are Bill and Charlie again with Butch, who I realize is is kind of a surrogate for myself. I mean, you forget that then there's this other fourth person standing behind this group, behind Butch. But in a way, I could be Butch with that kind of slightly teased gesture relating to these two interesting guys. And Charlie holding on to the string that turns on and off the light above. I love just like seeing his teeth through Butch's hair slightly. And Butch again. Our apartment with the bathtub in the kitchen, as you can see. The photographer Frank Franca on the left, who's become an iconic teacher of style and lighting at ICP for years, and the artist Dan Mahoney, who was one of my first close friends to die of age-related causes in the late 80s. He was a painter from who had also studied at the Boston Museum School. Cookie Mueller and John Hayes both starred in the Roman Polanski story, Gary Indiana's play that, as Phil mentioned at the beginning, I got to play Jack Nicholson in. And they're going out onto the roof of John's penthouse terrace. He had this tiny studio apartment, but this wonderful terrace around it in the East Village. And the rehearsals for that play and another play that I was in with both of them and called Phantoms of Louisiana, another Gary Indiana play. The rehearsals directed by Gary Indiana were very long, so I had a lot of kind of backstage time with Cookie. Although we were not really close friends, but she had such a dazzling stage presence, and then in life she could be very deadpan and unperformative. But then, like, I was always amazed at the way in which she would come alive in a performative way. It was, she was a writer as well as a performer, and then here's John Hayes, and sort of shows you why he was such a muse to many photographers and theater people too. He worked with Ethel Eichelberger and Charles Ludlam, and he and I worked together in theater several times. That face, those ears, that nose, that mouth. Here he is in his elevator. The person that photographed him the most was Peter Hujar, and they were very close friends and lived just a few steps away from each other. John again at a party with the artist Robert Vitale and Frank Franca in the background. And then a party on John's roof with Frank Franca, Peter Hujar, and Butch. Peter Hujar, I feel like I knew him through all of John's stories about him, and he knew me that way too. So we were always we would chat if we saw each other, but I didn't know him well. I went back to his loft when I first met him at a bar across the street from where he lived, and his horoscope was on the table, and I told him that I knew how to read them, and he asked me to read his chart. And we got into this deep conversation in the very first meeting, which was not necessarily a good thing to like go there with him, because I think he was a very private person. So anyway, I'll never forget that evening of reading his chart. And then the incredible Bill Rice with Peter here at the same party. Bill was an amazing painter who had been in New York since the late 40s, I think, and emerged around 1980 as an actor in many experimental theater works presented downtown from the 80s until when he died around 2008 or 9. So this amazing kind of deadpan comic actor, but also an incredible painter. There was a retrospective of his work at Stephen Harvey Gallery last year. But that's a small gallery, and it was, I feel like the big moment for the attention to his work has not yet come. Katie Nolan, who was a very close friend during those years, the kind of Garbo of the art world, who became a recluse around 92 or 93 and retreated from the New York art world for 25 years, but I'm glad to say is back. I love her work. It's really strong. When I met her, she was finishing Sarah Lawrence, studying acting, moved to New York and was going to auditions, and suddenly she reinvented herself as a sculptor and made work that was incredibly influential. There she is at the beach with Butch. I love going to beaches to photograph because then you could get beyond those tight New York apartments and have space. And especially the space on a beach kind of recedes into a sort of abstract planes with less clutter. Frank Franco with his best friend and our friend Shane Durley, an actress. And then at the beach again with Cookie, John, and Dan Mahoney. And the space there also allowed me, like in this picture, to do full figures, which I was really interested in, the sort of gesture, pose, attitude of the figure. This picture is not by me, but one of the fun things about the book was being able to include the photographs from the same time of my close friend Jane Warwick, who was a British artist who moved to New York around 1981 and lived here for many years, moved back to England last year. But she took a lot of pictures around 1981 of these same people, and most of us never saw them until the last couple of years when she started scanning them and sending them to us. So Michaela and I decided to use 4 of her pictures in the text part of the book at the back. That's Butch, me, and Frank Franco on the pier in the West Village. This was my first trip to Europe in 1984. Frank in a train station in Streatham Common. I wound up living in London for 2 years from 85 to 87. But this is the year before I moved there. And in the middle is the British artist Brian Britton, who has rarely shown, especially in the UK, and that's his sister Elaine, but he's a prolific and fabulous artist, and I have a lot of his work, and he's still thriving, not just making visual art, but also writing. He's a really great writer. He's done sketches of his Scottish childhood. The German painter, non-objective painter, Tillman, who lived in New York. And when Kirsten Bates and I co-adapted the writing of David Wojnarowicz and co-directed it in a sort of backyard East Village garden that belonged to Bill Rice, we initially had 8 actors, including myself, performing the material, but then Tillman moved back to Berlin and invited us to come to Berlin and perform in his loft. So we did that, and that's Butch and Frank taking a break from rehearsal in that Berlin loft in 1984. And then a few color pictures from the same loft and rehearsals of that piece. That's Brian Britton, the German actor Dominic Rock, and Frank Franca, and Kirsten Bates actually in the back, who was co-directing that with me. Another scene, that's John Hayes back there with Kirsten, and the playwright and performer Rosemary Moore at the Mirror. So in the book, there are 3 color sections. One is a series of pictures at the beach. Then there's one of scenes from the garden production of the David Wojnarowicz material, and then pictures from this space in rehearsals in Berlin. They're dropped into the book as sort of 3 different independent inserts. And we might say more about that later. They're Cibachromes. I shot them on slide film. And then back in New York in 1985, in Shane's apartment with one of her ex-boyfriends, Neil and Frank Franca, and Shane's sister, Anisha Durley, who was acting. I worked with both sisters, Shane and Anisha, several times, and they were in the final iteration of the David Wojnarowicz production. In fact, Nish and I auditioned at Actors Studio together, doing a Sam Shepard scene together. But as you can guess, we were not let into the Actors Theater. And I'm not an actor. I'm more of a, if anything, playwright/director. There's Shane in our own apartment reading something to us. And then Anisha and Shane. Callie was this glamorous pub person that we met in London who came back to New York and hosted some club evening and was a very close friend of Frank's. Charlie Boone again, you know, and again, my sort of romance with the idea of the artist, especially the painter in their studio. And then Daryl Ellis. Daryl, this is 1990. I met Daryl in 1981. An incredible, brilliant artist who worked in photography, painting, drawing, printmaking. And I'm very happy to say whose work is now receiving the abundant attention that it has always deserved. He died in 1992. This is in his Greenpoint apartment. He had asked me to come photograph him so that he could use those photographs to make work from. And he made some 3 amazing pieces, sort of isolating the figure and abstracting it. The frame that he chose to work from was one in which he's looking directly at me, but I always prefer this one more. John Hayes's studio apartment, photographing someone else there. And then this apartment that belonged to Angela Lyris, whose partner at the time was Nicola Tyson, the painter, British painter. They had this seminal art space in downtown New York called Trial Balloon, that a curator is now editing the archive to produce a book on the work of that few years in which they ran that gallery. That's Siobhan Little, the British artist, sitting there with the white parrot, and Siobhan is an amazing artist alive today, doing incredible work. Her exhibition at Trial Balloon was a really striking, poetic, minimal show. And she's gone on to make lots and lots of interesting work. That parrot might be alive today. We're not sure where it is. It was given to another artist. And interestingly, I was back in that apartment last year for the first time in 30 years, because my writer friend, Bertie Marshall from London, stays there when he comes to New York. Angela Lira still owns it, but lets him stay. So he was back there this year too. And I'll end with this picture. The book ends with another picture, but I'm going to end this with this. None of us can remember the name of this guy. I only met him that one night, but that's Siobhan Little in the background and Angela Lewis on the right. He was with another woman who was there, but this is again my interest in the expressivity of the figure and trying to photograph fast enough to catch something that would be, a pose that has a certain energy to it.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you
Thanks.
for that rich overview, and hopefully at least an introduction for everybody so that we have a sense of the shared repertory of pictures that we're talking about. It's a remarkable book that surveys 15 years of your life and work, from 1977 to 1992. And I think it is really evident in the book, and certainly in the way you just spoke about, what a rich, creative community you were a part of, and the sense of what was possible. And that's something in one of the previous books that you recently published in 2021, Fever, there's an epigraph from Charles Henry Ford that really speaks to the sense of possibility in New York. And I think that to an extent, and with qualification, carries over in this book as well. And there are many different directions that I think our conversation could go through with regards to that. But I was curious if you could reflect on, this is a very different book than Fever, which is really focused on color photographs that you made in 1 year in 1981, versus this is 15 years of black and white photographs. There's, I think, some differences in the types of pictures to an extent as well, and certainly the design decisions. But I wonder if you might reflect briefly for us on what the sort of differences are between that historical moment in which you were making the pictures. And I mean that somewhat in the sense that New York City is a very different place 40 years on, but also in terms of your intentions when you were making this work, and then what it has been like to revisit it in 2023, 2024, and how you think about the significance of those pictures, how that has gone into the editing of the book.
Thanks, Phil. Fever, yeah, it's interesting that Fever came first. And when we were doing Fever, again, all from 1981, all color, I did that book with Matt Lifehide and Matt Editions a couple of years ago. We thought about trying to use black and white pictures from just around that year or the year before and after, and didn't feel like it worked. So we just went with 1981. And it was my first kind of looking back and with this kind of depth, going back into negatives, chasing down things, printing certain things for the first time. I think that the mood of the two books is is really different, even if a lot of the people and the time period overlaps. And just also probably in that mood change speaks a lot to the difference between just color and black and white. Particularly the color that I was using was available light, daytime. A lot of those pictures were taken in apartments, in midday. And a lot of the material in Whereupon is lower light levels and early morning or very late night or evening, and the moods were different. I think the thing that was so odd and ironic about Fever and the color was that the color was so upbeat and beautiful. And that year, 1981, there was no sort of foreshadowing in those pictures, really, of the horrendous experience of the AIDS pandemic that came and impacted all of us so significantly. We were full of innocence and wonder. But I think Whereupon has a more well, and it's a bigger period and it goes through the 80s, and it has more references to a metaphorical darkness and psychological anxiety and certain things like that. And then just the difference in periods. I mean, it's hard to remember how inexpensive it was to live in New York in that period. My first apartment was $175 a month, and even adjusted for inflation, that's like very low. And that's all I paid for rent until the mid-90s and the various places in which I lived. So we had more time because we weren't having to work so hard for money. And I specifically avoided jobs that would take me too far away from being able to create. Butch and I, at the time we were roommates, were both cleaning apartments, and we had our own schedule and had the keys to all of these psychotherapists and writers' apartments in New York. And sometimes we would go dusting together, or she would have a great hand with the dust cloth and I would do the vacuuming or something. I mean, and then we would get it over and go rehearse something. And and let's see, Phil, that question had a lot of questions within it. I'm trying to think what else what else you asked.
Yeah, I mean, I guess a little bit like what differences there might also be between what you thought you were doing when you were making these pictures then, what the sort of original intentions were, and
Right.
how they're legible to you now, and the ways in which you might think that they function, if there is a difference now, for instance.
Yeah. I mean, and for me also, I didn't come from an MFA program. I did a BA in art history and English and was in an academic environment. And I took photo classes outside of the university and got into this Boston scene, which was great. And so perhaps I was more naive about art making and exhibiting and being in that world than some of my peers. But it's interesting looking back because some people in that work became hugely famous and had, incredible global careers, and others are getting more attention now, or other people moved into other interesting areas and didn't do art production anymore. But I couldn't have anticipated any of that. I mean, all of it, almost all of it was a surprise. There were a few artists who, you knew that you felt their ambition. It was like clear, but others was much harder to tell. So, I think you know, being in some of those small parties or settings with people, it just, you know, it reminds me of there was a lunch a brunch that I went to in the around 1984 when I was living on East 3rd Street in the East Village. And the photographer Shayla Bakal lived across the street and had a little brunch on her rooftop. And I went, I was a very small group of people, about 8 people there. But almost looking back, almost all of them were these legends of another generation. And yet it was just this very low-key, offhand kind of brunch, but in attendance were Jack Smith, Quentin Crisp, Paul Tech, Peter Hujar, John Hayes, Penny Arcade, and then Shayla, Frank, and myself. And you know, you just didn't think anything about it. I mean, well, I thought a little bit about it because I hadn't met some of those people before, but you know, it wasn't in spotlight. And of course, there's a lot of sadness for me about this period, looking back with so many people whose lives were cut short. But also looking back at this point has given me the kind of distance that I need really to be able to revisit it and get beyond that sadness to see, you know, to remember what it was like before all of that happened.
And this book seems to encompass that range and that development within it.
Yeah, it leads up to the beginning of my first book, which was Detour. And I feel like Detour is all black and white, all with this high-speed, fast, grainy film, Timex 3200. And I feel like the work of Detour in the 90s reflected more what I had processed from working in theater, like being interested in stepping back a little bit and seeing this constellation of figures on a stage, kind of, but without posing or directing people, but trying to be the fly on the wall that saw a charged configuration happening in real space and time. And the picture that I feel anticipated that was the one of Frank and Butch in 1984 rehearsing in Berlin, which has that feeling of the 90s more than anything else. So this work sort of leads into that, I think.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up because I think the connections to cinema and to theater and to the role of performance in this work are really striking, and that's built into the design structure that you alluded to before with these 3 scenes or episodes in color that are inserted throughout the book. The first of a trip to Brighton Beach, and then 2 theater productions, one in New York and one in Berlin, I believe. And there's the sense in which the performance and the performer are clearly things that you were thinking about, that you're interested in. You've already spoken a little bit about the formal language that you sort of developed or were exploring through this period. And so I wonder if there's a little bit more that you could tease out in terms of that, thinking about this relationship between the reality of this social creative world that you were inhabiting and navigating, and then the sense that these are also performances that are taking place for the camera. It is an intimate space, but you were also close with these people who many of them were sort of natural or trained performers in a way.
Right. Who were, yeah, a lot of whom were used to being looked at, which actually made it easier to like photograph them extensively. One of my favorite things about the design of this book, which is something that Michaela did completely on her own, it's her own talent as a designer, and I've never seen this in a book before, a photo book. In the color sections, each one is bookended by a mirror image. So it's introduced with a right-hand page. You turn the page, and that image is reversed then in a spread over 2 pages. So here, right, thanks, Phil. You see Frank on the beach, and then you turn the page, and oh wait, you turn 2
Yep.
pages.
Not having the effect I intended.
There, okay. And then, so you turn the page and you see the reverse image of Frank in a, a spread over 2 pages. And then you have another spread, and then and another spread, and then it turns, and then in the final spread you turn the last page and it flips again. So each color section is bookended that way with that mirroring, which, you know, if you casually look at the book or you just sort of flip through it, you don't notice. And you may not really consciously think about it if you're looking at it more carefully, but it creates this kind of back and forth deja vu like feeling that is so much like the whole retrospective looking back at this work in general. And I just love that. It's just like such a poetic aspect of the design. Um, I, you know, sometimes in the zines that we're working on together, Michaela would do things that were like so surprising to me. I really had to sit with them and think, well, what does it mean to do this? You know? And then I just thought it's different, it's interesting, and like wanted to give her as much license as possible in designing this book. And so even though the sequence is pretty chronological, there are certain choices that she made, like starting with the image of Paul, that are her decisions, and her sensitivity to the flow was great. I mean, just last night, like looking at the sequence for this and maintaining that sequence of the book, I was really struck by how carefully that edit was made.
It has a really wonderful rhythm to it. And I think one of the things of that design intervention that you described of the mirroring in the color episodes, going through each time, I feel like I pick out different elements of what's being structured through the book. And in this instance, then thinking about that portrait of John Hayes in the elevator and his reflection, partial in the mirror there, or there's another in the Berlin rehearsal sequences where somebody's looking in the mirror there, and you actually see a more direct vision of them through the mirror rather than you see them from behind elsewhere. And I think there's these sort of interesting thematic elements that recur throughout the book, and what you're describing then also to me feels like it really encapsulates one of the really remarkable qualities of your photographs here. And it is that sort of tension between the intimacy and the flux of what you're depicting, but also the structured visual language that you developed for representing this circle of people and the creative activities. And I think that's a remarkable and challenging thing to be able to pull off, and to do it with such gusto, this sense of the immediacy, but also the way in which the picture itself is something that is structured, that the disposition of figures in these spaces is incredibly careful and deliberate. So I just want to highlight that aspect of the book.
You know,
well.
I had said with Fever, we were considering having black and white, but decided it didn't work together. But I love it when black and white does work with color. And I love these color inserts in this book. I'm thinking, you know, of the book that David Armstrong did with Nan Golden that Scalo published in the 90s of, I think, was it in the 90s or later anyway? It was called, I think, A Double Portrait, in which their pictures of the same people were juxtaposed, but his early work was black and white. Hers was always color. So then you had that back and forth dialogue between black and white and color, which worked really well because they were tied together by the content. Jane Warwick just entered late, and Jane, you missed my shout out to you for the being able to use your pictures of us in the book. And Michaela is here too, and I just want to say, about this book tour that we're doing in Italy. We're going to start in Rome on May 28th at this fabulous bookstore called Leporello. And then we're going to do something in Milan and then come back to Palermo, where Michaela lives, during an experimental LGBTQ plus film festival. Then we're going to go to Zurich in early June. I'm not sure the exact dates of those except for the Rome signing on the 28th at Leporello. But if anybody's in Europe and, look for our postings about these. Zurich, I have a lot of friends in Zurich, hence going to Zurich, because I once showed with a gallery there and went there over and over for a few years. Made a lot of friends.
I want to be sure that we can open it up for questions, but if you'll indulge me one more, I wonder if you could say something about the title and how you arrived at Whereupon.
Titles are hard, and sometimes going to music is a good thing. So many titles in photography are about time or light. And this one is another one about time. So Whereupon, I like that it's about, basically what does that mean? It means immediately following upon, immediately after. And since it was coming after Fever in terms of the release, it felt apropos. But also for me, this period was after Mississippi, so there was that. And then it has this, it's like an odd word that you never hear spoken. Has this kind of fairy tale sort of mythic or more like tale quality to it. So I liked that it was a bit odd. What do you like it?
I do like it quite a bit. I mean, I think it, as you said, it has this temporal aspect. It refers to a kind of narrativity or suggests a narrativity, and the suggestion of what comes next in dramatic action, which again I think connects to some of these themes around performance that we've touched upon as well. So no, I think it's a lovely evocative title without foreclosing anything else that the book is doing as well.
I just was thinking about how much talking I feel like we did in that era versus this one, when nobody wants to get a phone call anymore. And I remember before moving to New York, Butch was in Boston, I was in Mississippi, and I used to call her late at night, and she would always take those calls, and we would talk forever. And I remember Katie Nolan and Dan Mahoney used to have these hours-long conversations from studio to studio, like in the 80s when they were just blocks away, but it was late at night and they were both working, but they would have these long, protracted phone conversations. And I don't even know if people have actual conversations like that anymore in this era, but let alone whether it's on the phone. I guess during the pandemic, there was a lot of Zoom talking. But, of course, being a Southerner too, I'm kind of a little bit garrulous, so.
With that, maybe we open it up if there are further conversations, and Alan and I have plenty more that we could keep saying, but I want others to have an opportunity as well.
Thank you so much, Phil and Alan. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat or unmute and ask. Actually, I have a question. I'm going to get started while people think about it. Alan, I would love to find out from you when and how it became clear to you that you wanted to revisit these images and scan them and make them into a book, if that was because of a specific event in your life, or if it just developed over all of those decades that you thought, or you always wanted to do that.
I had not always wanted to do it at all. And, I was thinking at the time that Tom Gitterman would have a show of the work from Fever, but he put it online during the pandemic. So he felt it was redundant to then have an in-person exhibition of it. And at first I was very disappointed by that, but he wanted to show the black and white work from that period. And then it was like a whole question, as it was with Fever. Well, how many pictures? Like in Fever, I thought there were about 15. And then we found 50 basically for that book. And similarly, with Whereupon, even though it's a longer period of time, I had really good vintage prints from that period, and we had 17 in the exhibition. And so again, I thought it was really a smaller body of work. But then when I started going into my archive, I realized that there were quite a few more. And there were some images that I had never printed before, never even thought about printing before, such as that close-up of Katie Nolan on the street, which I think because it was closer and because she was looking directly at me, it was kind of not so much what I was going for at the time. But now, it has a different impact. And
did you scan from negatives or from prints or both, or
we did drum scans from negatives.
From negatives.
There were a few instances in which I could not find the negative. I am horrified to say, and I'm hoping that at some point they'll turn up. But I found good slides that I had made at the time when artists had to send slides in for everything. I had some of those missing images,
Oh, that's great.
fortunately. And then,
Edward, sorry,
the same lab, which is Cooper Winterson at my own color lab, took the drum scans and tweaked them, to make them all consistent. And he also then scanned those slides to make those fit into it.
All right. Thank you, Alan. Edward, are there questions in the chat?
Yes, there are. And first, I wanted to mention that someone had asked where the book is available in New York, and I put the bookstores in New York where it's available: Dashwood, Karma, ICP, Printed Matter, 192, and Left Bank. And also from the publisher, it's available. The first question we've got is wondering, this person is curious how large the archive of images was and how long it took to curate it down to these selected ones. And I guess additionally, what was the process criteria to select images?
In the end, when I had compiled what I thought was usable, Michaela and I, went back and forth about which ones actually to use. And I trusted her decision as a designer, what would work. I mean, everything that I really wanted got into it. And it was helpful that I had a certain number of vintage prints, which were the basis for the Gitterman show, and they reflected what I prioritized at the time that I was making the work. Because at that time, I didn't print my own exhibition prints. So I would have to spend money. One printer did all of that work for me, someone named Mike Levin. And, it was expensive for me to do it. So I didn't, I only printed things that I really believed in. And so I had that work from that period, and that was the starting point. And then I just at home on my printer at home, I started scanning a lot of material that I had never really considered. And that was fun. And then sending those choices to the guy that did the drum scans was the final part of it. So, I mean, I don't think it was, it was not too laborious, because generally what I find is that what I think about the work, what I thought about it then is pretty much what I thought about it now. Like I go back into certain images and hope that they work when they still don't, but there were a few surprises. And I guess, with time and history having passed, I'm a little more open also to what it means to say they work. Something maybe has a little more historical value. Does that make it worthier? And generally, yes. Just as an example, that party scene on the roof of John Hayes's penthouse with Frank, Peter Hujar, and Butch, and the picture of Bill Rice and Peter. I mean, I never thought about printing them at the time. I didn't think that they were among my best pictures. But now, especially because Bill and Peter are both in them, but also there's something just about that casual juxtaposition of people at that time that makes it richer to me looking back.
So there's another question. I mean, one thing that was occurring to me is how cinematic a lot of your images are. And I know you've talked about, well, in fact, today you were talking about the influence of Antonioni on what you were doing. And we have a question, if you were, I'm kind of curious for myself to hear you talk a little bit more about the influence of filmmakers on what you were doing. But the question here is also, were you influenced by writers or, other literature and what you were doing at that time?
Yeah, definitely influenced by both. I'm a big fiction reader, and growing up, Southern writers were really important to me. Carson McCullers, Faulkner, Tennessee Williams, and Southern storytelling in general. In college, I was majoring in art history, but part of that was film analysis and film history. And I took a great class in Italian neorealism and cinema. And what interested me the most about that was, well, in early neorealism was the move to be more documentary, to use locations, non-professional actors, but also digression, to allow the kind of unforeseen, accidental, improvisatory work its way into the main narrative. But what I was most interested in really was where those early neorealist directors wound up in the 60s, like Fellini and Visconti and Antonioni and Pasolini, people who and De Sica, people who had a background in one kind of aesthetic in the 50s, became more stylized and individual in the 60s, and really with a lot of style, with a lot of individual style. And yeah, that period is still amazing to get to spend more time in Italy because of that, really.
Let's see. There's another question about at what point did you really know that photography was your medium, since you mentioned acting and directing and writing and all of that?
I think when I was finishing high school, I remember, like, instead of writing a paper, I was trying to write a screenplay adaptation of Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury. And I hadn't really told myself that I wanted to be a filmmaker. I was still more academic, but when I got into college, I was trying to take film classes, but I couldn't get into any of them or even still photography classes because I was not a major. And it's still like that at Harvard, which is where I was going. So I, as I mentioned before, I took classes outside of Harvard, which was a great thing because I had the teacher Henry Hornstein as my first teacher, who has been teaching for 45 years and is at RISD and is a great teacher and photographer. I kept, even after college, I thought about going to a film school and becoming a filmmaker. I really was a big movie person growing up. But also, while I was in college, I saw some pivotal still photography exhibitions that showed me what was possible to do, as a lone photographer with one camera. And that, made a deep impression. I think the first show that I saw that was extremely impactful for me was a group show at the Fogg Museum that had Emmett Gowan and Diane Arbus in the show. And they both, working in portraiture, were doing these like psychologically penetrating photographs. But Gowan, particularly because he was photographing in the South, made me think of the possibilities and the realm of photographing friends. Gowan and Larry Clark both made bodies of work about friends and family in that period that were very influential. But basically, in that period and for the whole decade of the 70s, the photography of one's friends was not legitimate in fine art. It was not being shown in galleries. Even into the 80s, if you think about, people probably think that Nan Goldin had more attention for her work like that earlier than she did, but she moved to New York in 77 and she didn't have her first solo show until 84. And then it was in this small storefront gallery of her friend Butch. In spite of the slideshows that she was doing everywhere, her book with Aperture came out, and that really made a difference. But I think the thing that really put that kind of work into the market was Sally Mann's work in the late 80s of her children. And of course, she was also heavily influenced by Emmett Gowan and all the work that he did in the late 60s, early 70s. Long answer.
So time for just two more questions. Here's one, wondering if you could talk a bit about the different aspects that you like about zine making and book making process, and how they inform one another in your practice.
Well, I love that it's cheap and that it's easy to do. And I haven't made artist books and I don't feel like I have those skills. So I was eager to work with Michaela, who has designed photo books, but it still was, a less, it was a more accessible process. And we printed them in Sicily and made it even less expensive. But it allowed us to play with ideas about design. And the first one that she did had some sort of really interesting design decisions in it that are kind of like what she did with the mirroring and Whereupon. So I just I mean, there's the great zine show that's at the Brooklyn Museum now, and I think, you know, a lot of the momentum in the early years of zines was do it yourself, inexpensive, accessible, etc. And now I think they've become a little bit more formal and designed, but they're still so much more affordable because actual photo books are still very, very expensive, and you know, um, and also, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Final question is someone is curious about the difficulty or conflict of being a photographer trying to make these pictures while also being a friend of these people in these intimate situations. And I guess how were people with having a camera and a photographer around in these moments where it seems like no one else was actually there?
So my comfort with people that I know is that's the easy part. I'm going then with my comfort zone, photographing the people that I know. I know for some people that's the harder thing to do. For me, the harder thing to do is photograph strangers. And it's just a personality thing. It's not some judgment about one or the other. In fact, I would love to photograph strangers more than I do, but I'm not comfortable with it. And once I know someone, or I don't have to know them that well, but you know, just that we know each other, or we have mutual friends or something, it makes me feel very free in the situation. And free to do what? Like I feel, especially with the 35 mm camera in those days, free to disappear into the room while being part of it socially, being a big part of the social context, but still recede in the moment. I think that's the harder thing to do, actually, technically, is in photography to photograph like that, to make decisions in the moment, to be commenting and interpreting in the moment. Like as a writer, you have years in which to process an experience and recall it and interpret it. And in this kind of still photography, you don't. And you know, I was, you know, pressing the shutter in anticipation of a second, not in response to a second, you know, like I didn't have to see it and then take the picture. I tried to anticipate it, just like be a second ahead of it in order to get a more natural and less self-conscious expression of movement and gesture and so on and attention. And you know, the good thing is that when you're doing that a lot around people, they get used to it and they become less self-conscious. I mean, I'm sure they're always aware of it in a way, but now using a medium format camera where the situation is so much more deliberate when I photograph people, the thing that I work against always is that self-consciousness. And sometimes I have to just keep shooting and shooting and shooting until I get to that point of um, the letting go of the self-consciousness. And the way that I try to get to that point is talking, is conversing, distracting, you know, not distracting, but to get into something in the conversation that is different from the act of photographing in that moment. But that's using, you know, a different format.
Gotcha. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you so much, Alan and Phil. And
Thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate it. And thank you again, Anya, for inviting me.
you
And
are
Phil
very
for having
welcome.
this conversation too.
All right. Thanks so much. See you at the next talk. We have another one in a week, as I mentioned to you. I posted that into the chat as well. And maybe see you at other talks. Thanks so much for joining us.